Gentlemen, we are going to start our session now. There was a little problem with joining in because our capacity on this Zoom platform is full. So many people could not log in into the Zoom platform directly. Therefore, we created another link to broadcast this webinar via Facebook Live. So you can see it through Facebook. You can go to the London Initiative Facebook page. Then anybody wishes to join, you can join through the Facebook Live as well. So ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start the session. We welcome all of you to this webinar organized by the London Initiative in collaboration with Ontario Centre for Policy Research. London Initiative as well as Ontario Centre for Policy Research are independent public policy think tanks located in London and Ontario, Canada. Our missions are to make impactful contribution towards policy making and provide useful recommendation for decision makers. Today, for this discussion, we have a high-profile panel. You can see the Right Honourable Lord Naseby, British parliamentarian from London, joining with us, and Dr. Palitha Kohona, current Sri Lankan ambassador to China, and His Excellency Mohan Peiris, Sri Lanka's current permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, currently joining from New York. The webinar is titled Responding to Reports of the Human Rights Council High Commissioner for the Human Rights on Sri Lanka. However, we are discussing the possible solution, Lanka's positive actions, past, ongoing, and also future, towards the sustainable peace, justice, and reconciliation in Sri Lanka, of course. The next session of the Human Rights Council is scheduled to begin on the 22nd of February and continue until 23rd of March. We have seen that a 17-page report was prepared for the upcoming 46th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council by the High Commissioner and made public on the 27th. In this report, criticizing heavily on Sri Lanka by pointing out 6 factors, that is what we see from this report, she sees those are emerging threats to reconciliation. Sadly, everything the current government has done to protect Sri Lankan citizens from the coronavirus pandemic and enhance national security is portrayed as majoritarian and exclusionary. Not only that, she recommends referring Sri Lanka to International Criminal Court, ICC, and to urge member states to prosecute the accused under universal jurisdiction. However, there are questions of the practical applicability of these recommendations, especially Sri Lanka referring to ICC as Sri Lanka is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, also universal jurisdiction in individual countries, becoming very difficult as also because almost practically unsuccessful where the accused has diplomatic immunity. Of course, ex-heads of states are falling into this exception. So according to the UK rulings on Augusto Finocchi's case, so some extent that could be possible. So we are not going into paragraph by paragraph to show what errors or what disagreements are. This exercise is not for that purpose. In general, we can respectfully identify some of the errors in the categories such as errors of fact, errors in law, errors of law, and errors in interpretation. We all know that Sri Lanka co-sponsored the resolution in October 2015, and UNHRC extended further 2 years period in 2017 to fulfill Sri Lanka's obligations, extended again in 2019. In March 2020, Sri Lanka informed the Council that Sri Lanka is withdrawing from the co-sponsorship, as well as the full withdrawal later on. Sri Lankan Foreign Minister Dinesh Gunawardena, while addressing the Council during the March 2020 43rd session of the Council, officially informed the Council on February 26th of the government's decision to withdraw from the co-sponsorship of resolutions. So while withdrawing the co-sponsorship of resolution 30/1 and subsequent ones, the government of Sri Lanka pledged to continue work with the UN and seek capability building and technical assistance in keeping with the domestic priorities and policies. Very importantly, domestic priorities and policies. So that is the Sri Lankan government's current position. This is where we are at the moment. The Human Rights Council's commissioner's report officially be submitted to the Council on the 24th of February by the High Commissioner during the interactive dialogue session. Also, we are aware that there will be a resolution to be submitted to the Council from the core group headed by the UK. So Sri Lanka has its preparations to face these challenges. So we know we have a panel of experts here with us today to discuss all these scenarios. So let us begin with our first speaker to see his views on this. Our first speaker is Dr. Palitha Kohona. He is the current Sri Lankan ambassador to China. He is joining us from China today, former Sri Lankan Foreign Secretary and former permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations in New York. Dr. Kohona comes from a foreign service with distinguished record in academics, international law, and practical diplomacy. He has advanced degrees from 3 countries and experience as a civil servant with the Australian, Sri Lankan government and the UN. I respectfully invite His Excellency Dr. Kohona for his speech.
Thank you, Jayaraj. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the London Initiative and the Ontario Policy Center for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I would also like to extend my greetings to Permanent Representative Ambassador Mohan Peiris and the Right Honorable Lord Naseby, whom we have been in touch with over many years. Reading through the High Commissioner's report, I'm really amazed, indeed amazed at what it contains. And now we have a draft resolution reflecting the report. Of course, this was to be expected. The High Commissioner, who is highly regarded in the UN system, and as a former president of Chile, and as a UN Executive Director for Women's Affairs, should have lent a name to this document simply denies explanation. It is meticulously detailed, painstakingly crafted, and scrupulously structured. But it is based on a multi-tiered edifice of lies, innuendo, and suggestion, which go back to previously debunked reports. And to an impartial observer, its goal is obvious. It seeks to kindle hatred and stoke vengeance. At this point, I recall a statement of the Buddha: hatred ceaseth not hatred, love ceaseth hatred, nahe verana verani. This report ignores the fact also that Sri Lanka has formally withdrawn from the co-sponsorship of Resolution 30/1. This is what amazes me. The High Commissioner contributes to the now familiar and orchestrated effort by some countries, influenced by a cabal of noisy lobby groups and NGOs, to embarrass Sri Lanka, to denigrate Sri Lanka and its leaders, and diminish Sri Lanka's achievement in eliminating a ruthless terrorist group, and also making a genuine effort to rebuild the country and to encourage reconciliation. And of course, the report seeks accountability. Let me ask the question, why was the High Commissioner's report compiled in this manner? Towards the end of the conflict, Mr. Miliband, the then UK Foreign Secretary, and Mr. Kohona, the then Foreign Minister of France, visited Sri Lanka. And under pressure from the Tamil expatriate groups and a noisy NGO community, and almost demanded that Sri Lanka stop the military operation against the LTTE, a group that had terrorized the country for over 30 years, causing widespread death and destruction. The president refused to comply. And I remember that he told Mr. Miliband bluntly that Sri Lanka was no longer Britain's colony and that to be told what to do by its foreign secretary was not acceptable. We proceeded to defeat the LTT and end the 30-year brutal conflict with its terrorism. As is abundantly clear from WikiLeaks, the UK and France were not alone. The US, Sweden, and Norway had this common goal. The rush visits of Mr. Erik Solheim to Washington are all documented in WikiLeaks. It is difficult to attribute a coherent reason for this affection for the LTTE by all these countries and their representatives, given that it had been proscribed by these very countries. I admit that it would have been purely humanitarian, but why is this bleeding-hearted humanitarianism not manifested elsewhere? In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, or Libya? What was so special about Sri Lanka, a country that eliminated a ruthless terrorist group, where children are no longer recruited by the terrorist group for combat purposes, where child soldiers are no longer given cyanide capsules by their terrorist minders, where underage girls are not married off early to avoid being recruited, where places of worship are not blown up, killing hundreds, where democratically elected political leaders are not assassinated at random, where mothers don't wait anxiously for their children to return home from school without being blown to bits by a roadside bomb, where husbands and wives do not travel together to avoid making their children orphans. There are no such uncertainties in Sri Lanka now, while these other places in the world are a horrendous mess. Yet, it is Sri Lanka's past that the High Commissioner seeks to examine in meticulous detail. Is it because that the High Commissioner's office is motivated by other factors? Or are its key funders otherwise motivated? Is it the strength of the lobbying, the campaign funds, and vote blocks that really motivate the High Commissioner's funders? Let us for a moment assume that these were not the key motivating factors. Yes, let us assume that. Then why was the High Commissioner's report filled with innuendo, insinuation, and suggestion? Let me take a few examples. I'm not going to go through the entire report of the High Commissioner. I could, but it has been done in the government's response, which has been all but ignored, along with its withdrawal of the co-sponsorship of 30/1. The report starts off by referring to credible allegations of indiscriminate shelling and 250,000 being interned for months. Immediately, a few questions arise. Credible. Credible in whose eyes? The eyes of those making the allegations? A number of contemporary reports have emerged, including by the military attaches of the UK and US. They do not speak of indiscriminate shelling, and we are grateful to Lord Naseby for having ferreted these reports out at great cost to himself. Has the High Commissioner even considered the views of the eminent persons report? They dismissed the allegations of indiscriminate shelling out of hand. Jeffrey Nice, Queen's Counsel, Rodney Dixon, Queen's Counsel, Desmond De Silva, Queen's Counsel, among others, were in this group. The resident doctor's statements recorded immediately after the war ended, have these been taken into account? In any event, the High Commissioner has not considered whether the retaliatory strikes by the military were necessary and proportionate. But her report highlights the allegations made by a nondescript group of entities. On the statement whether the refugees were detained for months in camps, what would the High Commissioner have preferred? For them to live in the elephant-infested jungle in Humpies, like the millions who live in makeshift camps in Yemen, Syria, Libya, to the great joy of the NGO community? You would have seen this on the CNN reports in the last couple of days. Children with distended bellies and sunken eyes being thrown bottles of water from passing luxury four-wheel drives of do-gooding NGOs? Is that what the High Commissioner would have preferred? Instead, those in our camps were fed 3 times a day, 3 good meals a day, given medical care. Children had their schooling, and they had proper shelter. In any event, over 1,000 square kilometers of land had to be cleared of indiscriminately laid landmines by the LTTE. The LTTE had even removed the roofing material of the houses as they herded the people with them as they retreated before the advancing military. The metal sheets, we later found out, were melted to make pellets for their improvised explosive devices. The people had no houses to go back to. A quick inquiry from Mr. Miliband would have revealed this. He visited the so-called internment camps with me for his company. Or is it more convenient to follow Nazi Goebbels' dictum? Repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. The report is critical of military officers who have been assigned responsibilities in government departments and institutions. Sri Lanka is not unique in employing retired soldiers in high positions. Others have had precedents emerging from the ranks of retired soldiers. In any event, our retirement age for senior officers is 55, an age when a man is not considered to be old anymore. It is difficult to imagine for a poor, under-resourced country like Sri Lanka to waste the talent, the experience, and the skills of a military officer retiring at 55. I find it difficult to understand the emotive expression, majoritarianism, employed by the High Commissioner. In a democracy, it is the majority that elects a president or a government. It would be self-destructive for a leader of a government so elected not to reflect the views of the majority. Even the protection of antiquities, it's not spared in the report. This is like saying that the protection of Egyptian antiquities would offend the Muslim population of that country, or the protection of the Parthenon would offend the Orthodox Greeks of Greece. The antiquities being protected are part of the entire nation's patrimony. The LTT strategy towards the end appears to have been simply to keep the civilians as a human shield. This provided the context for most of what happened in the final stages of the war. In the first instance, it was assumed that the human shield would slow down the progress of the military. Secondly, as Tamil children so jubilantly said on record, a few civilian deaths would force the international community to intervene and save the LTT. Failing all else, it would provide the basis for war crimes allegations once the conflict ended. This would have been particularly useful if the plan to airlift the LTT leadership out of Pudumathalan had succeeded. The LTT and the High Commissioner's report ignore the fact that the UN Secretary General, the US Secretary of State, and many others had called on the LTT repeatedly to let the people go. They refused to heed this call. Against this background, it is difficult not to come to the conclusion that the High Commissioner in a report simply did not wish to assist a state member of the UN to improve its performance consistent with her mandate, but was determined to embarrass Sri Lanka and push it into a difficult corner. Her task, her mandated task, is to work with member states to advance human rights, not to act as prosecutor and judge. It is difficult for a country to defend itself against unsubstantiated allegations and insinuations. No domestic legal system would permit that. The High Commissioner's office appears to have, over the years, misunderstood its role. The Council was never established by its founders to isolate countries, identify them singly, and chastise them individually. It was designed to help countries to improve their human rights performance. The Council's job is to assist and to encourage, not to punish. This was the objective of those who created the Council in the first place, having terminated its predecessor. The High Commissioner has no authority to enforce the Council resolutions. Now, she turns to helpful countries to enforce principles which, in the view of many, have never been endorsed by the international community as a whole. The High Commissioner's report even suggests punitive measures in other fora, perhaps to bring Sri Lanka to heel or to make it an example. Again, it would seem that the report mistakes her role and places into the hands of those wishing to punish Sri Lanka. As to whether this is consistent with the High Commissioner's mandate is doubtful. This reeks of vengeance-seeking hatred. It is also important to remember that our culture, the Eastern culture of Sri Lanka, is not based on the values of an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth principle. Our culture is based on the principles of forgiveness and forgetting, not confessional atonement and the justice of the Inquisition. It may be difficult for those imbued with these age-old Western concepts to understand this, but let's remember that the world consists of a range of and multiplicity of cultural traditions and principles. That is why the Sri Lankan Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission adopted a restorative justice approach rather than a punitive justice approach, even for those who may have violated the basic norms of our society. Restorative justice, of course, takes time. It is not without reason that 12,000 former combatants were rehabilitated and returned to their families. For us, meting out justice does not necessarily mean meting out punishment. History is replete with situations where punitive justice did not succeed in achieving reconciliation, while restorative justice has produced results in almost every instance, for example, in South Africa and Uganda. Since the end of the conflict, the Sri Lankan government has adopted extensive measures to achieve reconciliation and justice. Most land occupied by the military has been returned to the original owners, some of whom returned from overseas to reclaim their land. Most infrastructure destroyed during the conflict, including railway lines, roads, schools, fisheries harbors, temples, and community facilities have been restored. The railway tracks and sleepers had been used by the LTTE to construct bunkers. Hundreds of missing persons have been accounted for. Much more needs to be done, of course, but we are a poor country. It will take time. There are other parts of the country in addition to the north and the east, which need to be developed as well. Our resources are limited and new funds are required. I wish the High Commissioner's report had also spared some thought for what we have done and for these aspects as well, instead of purely searching feverishly for guilty parties to punish. Finally, let me repeat, it is not hatred that ceaseth hatred, but love. Nahe verana verani. Those who seek vengeance will have vengeance trailing them to eternity. Thank you.
Jayaraj, unmute your system.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for the good introduction from Dr. Palitha Kohona in regards to the Human Rights Council Commissioner's report, as well as a good comprehensive analysis on this report. We always consider Dr. Palitha Kohona as the authority of the subjects pertaining to the Human Rights Council. He's the most senior diplomat who's been served in various locations, including the UN, UNHRC. So his authority, his wordings are very important to us. So I'm going to the next speaker now. Now I'm introducing our next speaker, that is His Excellency Mohan Peiris. He is the current permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations in New York, USA. He is joining from New York today. He is the former Chief Justice, former Attorney General, and the President Counsel. I respectfully invite His Excellency Mohan Peiris to address the webinar.
Thank you, Jayaraj. May I thank the London Initiative with its Ontario partners for inviting me this morning. It's morning for New York to participate at this webinar, which deals with an important report of the Human Rights Commission at a very critical time. Now, having heard His Excellency Palitha Kohona spell out in pretty much detail the background to this whole, which I would describe as a fiasco in the Human Rights Council, I could probably only add some of the features that I thought might be appropriate without having to repeat myself with regard to the factual circumstances. Now, I thought it might be interesting, before I forget, to deal with that little incident that Palitha was pleased to narrate to us about the meeting with Bernard Kouchner and David Miliband. Now, I think if I recall correctly, Palitha was there with me at that meeting, right? To complete that story, I can vividly remember David Miliband making three interesting, when I say interesting, perhaps surprising requests. Number one, he made a request of our present president, who was then the Secretary of Defense, that he be allowed with Bernard Kouchner to travel to and visit the LTT who was holed up in that strip of coastal land. That was the first request he made, to which our president very gently responded and said, well, that might be the biggest risk I would have to take. I might have to stop the war because you might be taken hostage. That was his first response. Palitha, you will remember that.
Yeah.
Number two, then he said, well, I have another request. And he said, is there a possibility of us talking with them? Well, he said, by all means, if you can talk with them, you can certainly do so. We have no objection to that. And will you agree to a ceasefire? I remember our president looking around to all of us, and I think we were on the same wavelength. There was no question. His Excellency said, yes, of course, we would be agreeable to a ceasefire. So there was perhaps a little reason for cheer. The third request was, quite frankly, preposterous, if you remember, Palitha. I really fell off my chair when it was made. He said, would you agree to the LTTE surrendering to us? Could you believe it? The LTTE surrendered to us. Quite frankly, His Excellency the President, who was then the Secretary of Defense, chuckled and said, I'm afraid I cannot actually agree to that. And I say, and I did remind His Excellency recently, that was when our problems began. And I think Palitha would agree with that. And that's perhaps why he focused on that particular meeting. That was when our problems began. We were not willing to go along with our colonial masters. That was when perhaps the decolonization program began, although unwittingly, we probably didn't think about it. So that's a little bit of background that adds to the spice to this whole issue. Now, Palitha was also pleased to make this observation. He said, he was shocked and surprised at the report. That's one way of putting it, Palitha. But quite frankly, I was not shocked and surprised at the report. You might wonder, well, I was not. Why do I say that? If you look at that report from 2000, I have been associated with the Human Rights Commission since perhaps 2006, right up to the end of the conflict until I became Chief Justice. Quite engaged right in the thick of it. If you look at these reports from then to now, they are ad nauseam consistent with what it says. So consistent that I could probably predict the next line and the sentence that they would trot out. And I did make this point when I say core group, we have a core group in Colombo too. And you probably know that. And when at the core group meetings in Colombo, I did say that in as much as the Human Rights Commission has been so consistent and repeatedly saying the same thing, virtually churning out the same rhetoric every term, we in turn have been churning out a response which is equally consistent. Now, this is something interesting, Palitha. And I do say that it is that, and what happens? They say it, we respond to it, resolutions are passed, we fold our books in Geneva, go back home. And then we try our best to do whatever we can. We come back again and do the same thing, and we go through the motions so consistently that every bit of the activity is predictable. Now then, if that is the consistency with which both sides conduct themselves, and nothing, if the end result is that everybody feels that not enough is being done, then isn't there something missing that both sides are perhaps not giving their mind to? Think about it. I did espouse the posture to perhaps the diplomats even in Colombo before I came, that there is something very seriously missing in the rhetoric. What is it that is missing? I took the view, you might think it rather surprising when I say it, coming from my very legalistic background. I begin to feel that this whole issue is being looked at very legalistically. You know, when lawyers, of course, with all respect to my community, when we lawyers get involved, lots of simple things get very complicated. that goes without saying. So you will see that the Human Rights Commission keeps on pointing to us the treaties, the obligations, the protocols, whatnot. And we keep on coming up with answers, responding with very legal positions as to why it can be done or why it can't be done. So then, in other words, the approach is full of jurisprudence, and I think it's too much of jurisprudence.
Yeah.
I don't know how you would agree to it. So my view is that we look beyond the law.
Oh.
We look beyond the law. Not look for legal, because the law provides ready refuge to provide answers to any complicated problem. Yes, we all know that. We are learned enough to know that with our experience. So there you are. What is it? Should we now look at this problem differently? And that is perhaps through the lenses of humanity, perhaps through the lenses of Ubuntu, which we are familiar with, the South African concept of common humanity. After all, my dear friends, at the end of the day, we have to assure the happiness of our people, not the happiness of the Human Rights Council, not our own happiness, not the happiness of academics or perhaps those in government. No, there is a public trust in all of us to espouse and to live by, to ensure happiness of our people. Now, so there you are. My plea is that we all look beyond a legalistic approach and examine where the gaps are in order to bring this whole fiasco to an end. This story must come to an end. Surely it can't be going on for 10, 11 years. Of course, Palitha quite rightly gave us the reason as to why this should be whipped up and kept boiling for over 10 years. I don't need to go into that aspect of the matter. Now, having said that, can I just come to something a little more, perhaps a little more formal? We all agree that the current world order and the United Nations were created on the foundation of multilateralism. Multilateralism. Now, multilateralism implies that the world order is built through a consultative process which embraces the recognition and the respect for sovereign equality of all states, and is based on the principle, Palitha and Lord Naseby probably will know that, the principles of non-intervention, non-aggression, international cooperation, mutual benefit, and mutual respect. So, but it is regrettable to note that the Sri Lankan situation, as Palitha quite rightly pointed out, that the Sri Lankan situation is being exploited to dismantle the norms of the current global order and replace them with unilateral standards of governance and a mechanism of intimidation that would promote a new liberal hegemony in countries in the non-aligned movement and the global south. That's my personal assessment of what it is. Now, human rights, unfortunately, has become a convenient platform by which these policies are pursued by members of the international community who have, unfortunately, if I was to use that expression, blood on their hands. So the Commissioner's report in that context contains some, in my respectful view, dangerous precedent-setting concepts contrary to the United Nations Charter and violative, I say, of international law, and I strike a note of caution and I say that the Commissioner shall take cognizance of that fact and not fall into that particular situation. Now, at one point of the report, it is shocking to note, I say, as Palitha said, and perhaps not so shocking to note, as I said. The Commissioner says, if the state is not willing or unable to protect its citizens, we in the West shall intervene. Sweeping generalization. That I could understand if someone on city street said it. But coming from the Commissioner. Now these, in my view, are dreams and thoughts of the ghosts of the past and need to be consigned to the limbo of forgotten things I can tell you, in the history of the General Assembly. In another instance, the report projects the doctrine of universal jurisdiction. If you look at it carefully, universal jurisdiction. Now, where that comes from is anybody's guess. I don't think even God, who probably made this planet, this universe, ever thought that universal jurisdiction could ever work, actually, quite frankly, which has been completely, the concept of universal jurisdiction has been completely rejected by the members of the African states. Think about it. What this means, what is it that it means? What it means is that a person in one country acts in a manner that is consonant with the laws of that country, but is contrary to the laws, for example, of, we'll say, the UK or the United States jurisdiction. This doctrine permits that person to be tried in the latter, under the latter jurisdiction, under whatever that law is, in a courthouse which is outside our jurisdiction. Now, this is not fancy dreams. We saw this in recent times in the California courts, which quite rightly rejected such adventurism when certain actions were filed against His Excellency the President. Very recently, just last 2 years ago. Now, let me leave that for a moment and bear with me if I was to just focus on just a few other aspects of the report. What would be, for example, the fate of our heroic soldiers if the co-resolution is passed in Geneva? Now, it must be appreciated that unilateralism will usher in perhaps if I was to use the word, a very frightening world, where the developed countries will be permitted to intervene militarily anywhere in the world. What do you think of that? With or without international support. The rationale for, and the rationale for their intervention is, what is the rationale? Their interests. Is that what the High Commissioner wants? Whatever that may be. So it must be appreciated, I say, with all respect to the Council, right? It must be appreciated that whatever happens in Geneva on the 22nd of February not only affects Sri Lanka. Now, this is a message that goes out loud and clear, perhaps to all other jurisdictions in the same classification as us, right? That it not only affects Sri Lanka, it will surely compromise the member states, certainly in the non-aligned movement and in the global south. Now, when this core group that sponsors this resolution, when they launch it in Geneva, what happens? What really happens if we stay quiet? I think we cannot stay quiet. Palitha, you probably will agree, and Lord Naseby would. The voices of all of our friendly countries would be neutralized. So we need to resolutely respond to the exaggerations of the Human Rights Council, the sources of which who draws in aid and perhaps encouragement from the members of the rump of the non-state actors who have taken very comfortable refuge in Western jurisdictions. So we need to take a lead to stop this sanctimonious initiative from finding ground in Geneva. I think we need to give leadership to the countries in the non-aligned movement and the global south, therefore. It goes without saying, and I think fundamentally we reject the resolution being tabled, which will be a major step. I say if it does get tabled, and if it's put through, it will be a major step towards the recolonization of all the previously colonized countries. That will be the beginning. So if it has to go to a vote, let it go to a vote. So it is only then, I say that that's one message that we can get across clearly to our friendly countries who are like-minded, to articulate their support for Sri Lanka. It is, I think, if we adopt and pursue such a course of action, that would certainly be certainly advantageous, and there can be no compromise whatsoever with these nations that accuse us and tarnish us with, as Palitha said, with blatant lies and unsubstantiated villainy, while the accusers themselves are in breach of international law in terms of the UN Charter and this procedure. My dear friends, it may be noted that Resolution 40/1 required the Office of the High Commissioner and the relevant special procedure mandate holders, in consultation with and with the concurrence of the government of Sri Lanka, engage with the government. However, it is pretty obvious that the constructive engagement contemplated has not been manifested in the report. Now that's very important. The report doesn't disclose it. Further, the reference made by the High Commissioner that the Council is, now these are the words used, the diplomatic language which Palitha and Lord Naseby are very familiar with, deeply concerned by the trends emerging over the past year. Now that's very interesting. Deeply concerned by the trends emerging over the past year. Now, what are the major things that emerged in the past year? We had a presidential election followed by a parliamentary election. We had an Easter bombing. Then we are struck by a pandemic. Now, to me, those are perhaps the major events deeply concerned by the trends emerging over the past year. So perhaps the most important trend after the Easter bombing was the change of government. Now that leads me to make an interesting observation. After 30/1 was put in place, where in fact, recently one of the diplomats said, Ambassador, your country is unique. You are one set of guys who successfully managed to sponsor a resolution against you. That's what your friends, Palitha, who told me recently. And they said, look, and they laughed. They laughed. What the heck are you doing? That's what they simply said. Now, what did 30/1 do? They gave us 5 years of peace from the Human Rights Commission. Look at it carefully. Did anything seriously change from 2015 to 2020? Did anything change? Did the problems of our Tamil brothers and sisters change, disappear, improve? No. Was there political stability? No. Was national security better? No. Was corruption brought down? No. Right? So there's a series of negatives that actually took place within that 5 years, but still the Human Rights Commission was mum, was silent, deathly silent, if I was to use that oxymoron. There we are. Now, the 5 years ran with peace, and that was the only benefit we had. Then what happens? It was like the scenario changed. As soon as the elections changed, the elections were held, and the government changed, down came the old complaints. The ghosts of the past started to visit us. So what is the human rights? So one begins to wonder whether the bona fides of the Human Rights Council are well made out. Down comes violations of human rights, discrimination of our Tamil brethren in the north, inadequate development, the security situation is bad, the COVID situation is not properly handled, Our Muslim brethren who pass away are not buried properly. All kinds of things start to flow back on the table. Who does this? Human Rights Council. Why should it do it? After all, it consigned it to the limbo of forgotten things for 5 years. What is it that excites them suddenly to come up with all this critique? My dear friends, it appears that the change of government was very uncomfortable. The change of government was very uncomfortable. Here we have a new government with a new thinking, a new commitment, an overwhelming mandate that was given by our people through a constitutional mechanism of the exercise of universal adult franchise. The government is empowered to do what it takes to put Sri Lanka on the map. So there we are. I think that alone is a clear manifestation of the mana fides with which, if I was to use that legal expression, the bad faith with which the Human Rights Commission, most respectfully, I say, is embarking on it. And I implore and I beg of them and the international community and the core group to think twice before they pursue this course of action. Because I can assure them, as I've assured them in Colombo, that we have a fine opportunity to do what it takes under a government which has a mandate of the people, and they can use that mandate to put all these mechanisms which we embrace with both hands, with all our might, because we know that some of those recommendations made by the Human Rights Council are for the good of the country, and that adopting them would be favorable. We can turn our country into a heaven on earth. So there you are. Do not miss this opportunity. It is not only an opportunity that will be missed by the Human Rights Council and the core group, and I do say this, that it will be an opportunity that is missed by my brothers and sisters of the Tamil community. Now, very recently, just finish off, I had a little video clip that came to me on my phone of little children, young children, who perhaps in their 15s and 16s, talking about their of these very bad singular population that is back in Sri Lanka. I was just wondering whether they were really promoting child soldiers again. The only thing those little children that came on the phone, their pictures, was that they hadn't a cyanide capsule around their necks. That's all they didn't have. But they were talking perhaps of something that they were remotely connected. And this is what my Tamil brothers and sisters, some of them, not all of them, some of them are doing. It is a misplaced idea to, as Palitha quite rightly said, to promote thoughts of hatred. Hatred, there is hatred begets hatred. It doesn't actually solve the problem. And as he quite rightly observed, it is what the need of the hour is love, and love of our brothers and sisters as one family of one Sri Lanka and one nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. It is we have seen that you have taken a very innovative approach to your address by looking at the issues from your experience during the time of the last phase of war. Also, both of you, Dr. Kohona and you, were there at that time, so you must have been having a good experience while involving peace negotiations and so on. So now we are listening to some of these experiences first time. Also, you have presented a very constructive and diplomatic approach you are suggesting to apply to current challenges. Such approach will definitely heal the wounds and eradicate misunderstanding within the concerned parties. Now I am going to our next speaker, Right Honorable Lord Naseby. Lord Naseby is I believe most of you all know that he's a British politician. He's from the Conservative Party. We all know that Lord Naseby has extensive knowledge and interest in the Indian subcontinent. We have seen his book. I have the privilege to attend this inauguration ceremony of the launching ceremony of the book, especially the LTT terrorism in Sri Lanka. He started all-party parliamentary group on Sri Lanka in the Palace of Westminster, which compasses the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and has been active supporter and defender for Sri Lanka ever since. Floor is yours, your Lordship.
Ayaban to everybody here this morning, this evening, this afternoon. As you just said, I've worked for nearly 50 years. I don't support any political party or religious faction or ethnicity. I just love the country of Sri Lanka. I first went in 1963 to work for the Reckitt and Coleman Group, spent nearly a year, met many people, and in those days, I found it a magical country, and I fell in love with it. So today, I was amazed to read this report from the UN HRC. 17 pages, most of it pretty vicious, full of allegations, recommendations, which in my judgment treats Sri Lanka as almost a vassal state of the United Nations, and certainly infringes on the right of any sovereign country. And they look at the recommendations, 2 full pages of recommendations. And what I thought when I read this, I thought, I have to analyze this. I'm supposed to be in recess, according to my wife, which means that I should be resting. But I decided not to rest, or rather to use the rest to produce a report on the recommendations from this UN body. And the first point to make is really that somehow or other, it just glosses over the war. It forgets that who the LTT were, that they killed all the moderate leaders of the Tamil society, that they killed the president of Sri Lanka, the president of India, many senior ministers, many other politicians, and even more individual citizens. No mention of that. And there's a tenor that flows through the report, which really goes back to the report that was produced, the Darasman report, after the war by a 3-man committee of senior UN people. Evidence was taken, but we don't know who made the evidence, because the UN in its wisdom decided that the sources of this report should be hidden away for several decades. So we don't know who said or made the allegations on which this report is based. So I thought, right, well, we better have a look at this then in more detail. And I went through the report. There are 10 issues that I raised. And the first one is the basic law of war. This was a war. This is not a small uprising. This is a war. And the law that's relevant is the law of armed conflict, otherwise known as international humanitarian law. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but this was confirmed by the late Sir Desmond de Silva QC, and this is the important point, the former chief prosecutor of the UN-sponsored War Crimes Tribunal. And he made the point that the European Convention on Human Rights is wholly inappropriate for application in combat and battlefield conditions. So that's point number 1. And it's high time that people recognize that in the United Nations. Secondly, and on this area, I have done a lot of work. I think I could almost claim to have done more work on this than any other person living, and that is civilian casualties. Because the Dar-es-Salaam report said it was 40,000 or thereabouts. Other official UN bodies have said, well, it's more than that. And that totally ignores people like Ambassador Blake, the American ambassador on the ground during the actual war, who said it's about 6,000. The UN in-country team at the time, on the ground in Sri Lanka, 7,700 plus, according to them. The plus bit being not exactly 7,700. The census after the war, done by Tamil enumerators, says 7,400 or thereabouts. Interestingly, given that Germany is part of the core group, there was a journalist from Der Spiegel who was on the ground from January 1 right through to May the 18th. He says 5,000 to 7,000. Now, I did a little bit of work, I think, as most people know. I decided to do a freedom of information inquiry on the dispatches from Lieutenant Colonel Gash, who was the UK military attaché on the ground in the battle, making notes on what was happening and sending dispatches back to the UK. Now, I pay my taxes. I am a UK citizen. I have the right to ask a freedom of information, as does any other citizen. So I started off in August 2014. You have to technically send it to the Foreign Office, which I did. Some months later, I was told it was turned down. And this charade, and it came as charade, I was turned down regularly about every 3 or 4 months when I pointed out this, that, and the other. I then turned to a half appeal system we have with the Information Commissioner, told him the story, and lo and behold, he said, I think you have a point, Lord Naseby. So he was on side. And as a result of his work, nearly 2 years after I started this exercise, we got the dispatches in a very redacted manner, far more redacted than is normal in the UK. I particularly think of the report on the Iraq War as a comparator. Then I looked at the dates, and all of a sudden I discover, well, there wasn't anything for May, and I think there was one from April. So I said to my new found in the Information Commissioner, my friend, what do you think? Do you think Colonel Gash went on holiday? No, he said there must have been some. So we asked the Foreign Office again, and as lo and behold, another 4 turn up. That was on a different computer system. Well, I wonder to this day whether there weren't many others, but I can't prove that one way or the other. But it's on somebody's conscience if that is the situation. So those figures that Colonel Gash gives us, 6,500 or thereabouts, compared to the 40,000 plus that the UN in Geneva are working on. So that's pretty hopeless, isn't it? Then we come to war crimes. We're told that the recruitment of child soldiers is a key issue. It is, because there are no child soldiers in the Sri Lankan armed forces. Just says both sides. Well, it doesn't. That's inaccurate. There were none in the armed forces. They were recruited by the Tigers, and UNICEF says over 5,000 of them. That's a huge number. And they also say that the vast majority of people who fought for the LTTE, the vast majority killed, were the child soldiers. And yet, here we have in the UK, the lady who was actually one of the organisers of recruiting child soldiers on the ground in Sri Lanka, Australian lady, British by marriage, and it's recorded on a BBC programme on October the 23rd, 1991 at 21:30 hours. there we have it. Then, of course, we go to the disappearance of a reference to 11 aid workers in 2008, 2009. Yes, that's bad. But there's no mention of the 600 police who gave in on instructions from the Prime Minister of the day. They gave in the Eastern Province, handed over to the LTTE, and were all murdered. Then there are allegations of credible and indiscriminate shelling of hospitals. We all know that the government of Sri Lanka offered no-fire zones, refused, and then the Tigers put their guns right next to the holidays, right next to the hospitals. That in itself is a war crime. And the rules of war dictate that if somebody fires a gun at you, you have the right to fire back. And there's an interesting quote from Ambassador Blake on that. Then there's the one that Miliband took about humanitarian supplies. Well, it wasn't the fault of the armed forces of Sri Lanka that the LTTE decided that they would no longer guarantee safety for the supplies coming in driven by UN workers. So that obviously reduces the amount that comes in. But nevertheless, at the end of the war, the go-downs or the warehouses were reasonably full of the normal supplies, simply because you, quite rightly as a country, because of the monsoons, you insist that the civil servants have the basic in their warehouses, in the local government, have sufficient supplies for 6 months. And there were supplies of all the needs in these warehouses. Problem that the Tigers were not allowing sufficient food and wherewithal for the poor people who've been driven out of Jaffna. 250,000 or thereabouts, a huge number, huge number. Then there are claims of torture. My last 3 visits to Sri Lanka, I've been and talked to the ICRC, the International Red Cross. Different person each time. I asked a simple question. Have you seen, as the Red Cross, any sign of torture as defined by Geneva? Every one of them, all 3 different people, has said, no, Lord Naseby, we see no sign. Yes, we are in all the important places, the courts, the prisons, the immigration entry. No, we've seen no torture. Yes, some heavy handling. Well, frankly, we get heavy handling in the UK, and everywhere has a bit of heavy handling. Then we come to the military camp, the so-called military camp. 250,000 people rescued by the Sri Lankan army. Yes, rescued by them, partly because they came through the lines each day, and it's all recorded in the dispatches by Colonel Gash of Tamils, brought through the lines, welcomed, looked after, and then put in for their own safety the camp. The biggest camp, Manic Farm, which I have visited myself with my wife, a doctor, and we went round it separately to make sure it was looked proper or not. But International Red Cross, they were there day one. That camp was established. And these poor people, 250,000 of them, half-starved, ragged, hugely upset, given somewhere safe to be looked after. And it wasn't an easy job, not at all an easy job. And within them, of course, we know there were 11,000 Tamil LTTE Tigers. But they were looked after, and afterwards they were retrained and rehabilitated, and that has gone extremely well. Nothing else, nobody else reports that either. And quite frankly, there was no room for anybody else in the camp in terms of NGOs, etc. And so we now come to the current situation. Oh, before I forget, of course, they got nowhere to go back to. 250,000 people, homes destroyed. Thankfully, the then government under Mahinda Rajapaksa had a major program of rebuilding houses, helped by India, helped by a number of other nations. Sadly, my own country, despite some pressure from me, no, nothing. And I remember Mr. Cameron going there and chastising Sri Lanka for not having rehoused everybody. But of course, we didn't offer any help. So not surprising they weren't all rehoused. And today we have a situation where those people now are almost all back. Certainly the power's back on in the north, the infrastructure's been repaired, etc. And that itself was a huge achievement, huge achievement. After the Rajapaksa presidency, we had Sirisena and Wickremesinghe, full of good ideas. Not a lot happened on the ground. And then we move, as we know now, to the new president, Gotabaya, and his brother, now the Prime Minister. Well, your elections, and I visited as an observer a number of your elections, are every bit as good as ours. Your turnout is better. And if the people of Sri Lanka vote in a party, then so be it. Then that government is there to govern. And then I read the bits that make me really cross. Criticism that nothing had been done on a number of issues in the last 12 months. Well, hasn't anybody in Geneva noticed that there is a pandemic? My goodness, what a disaster's hitting the world. How on earth could anybody make any progress on any of these issues, any more than we can in the UK? And finally, the Sri Lankan government done well, done very well. Your population is about 22 million, about just over 400 people have sadly died. Our population in the UK, about 66 million. The latest count, no less than 120,000 or thereabouts have died. So who's done the better job at looking after their people? In my submission, the government of Sri Lanka has done a better job than my government here in the UK. And finally, I finish with a quotation that from some people called the Legatum Institute. In their report they published in late November of 2020, they praised Sri Lanka, this is some independent organization, for the real progress made over the last 10 years. And on page 62 of the report, it says, over the past decade, Sri Lanka has made significant progress in addressing the constraints to its development. This progress has resulted from concerted efforts to build the institutional capacity and quality of the healthcare and education sectors, increasing access for its citizens to these key enablers of prosperity, especially in the rural areas. The results have been nothing short of remarkable. It concludes by saying, Sri Lanka is the most improved nation over the last 10 years. I just hope the UNHRC will recognize this achievement. However, sadly, I question they probably aren't even aware of it. Thank you all.
Thank you, Your Lordship. You saw the injustice to Sri Lanka, miscalculations, biased reports, and not only that, you went further to defend your position by reaching out to the court to get the right information, and to the UK government as well as the UNHRC, you presented them. There is no doubt that the people in Sri Lanka are highly indebted to you. I still remember I was one of the very few first interested party to obtain copies of those reports. I recall a few years ago, I met you with our colleagues at the House of Lords, and I arranged them to hand over to the relevant officials, including the president at that time and the relevant opposition as well. Still, we have a doubt whether Sri Lankan government has used them appropriately. So moving on, now we are moving to our questions and answer session. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all of your questions, but we will try our best to answer many of the questions as we can. First question is to your Lord Naseby. I will highlight it. I highlighted you, and this question is a very interesting question. I just received this one as an email. Very good one, very interesting one as well. This is the question: if LTT had won the civil war in 2009 and established ELAM, would there have been allegations of war crimes and violations of human rights against Sri Lanka? This is from a lawyer, attorney at law, Shantini Walgama.
Well, I think the amazing thing probably is with the worldwide coverage the LTTE has achieved, they probably might have a go at Sri Lanka because it would be a new state and it would soon be obvious that it was a rogue state. But nevertheless, in the glory of having won the war, defeated Sri Lanka, become a separate state, I dare say they might even have chanced their arm at having some activity to prosecute the main part of Sri Lanka.
Okay, thank you for the reply, Your Lordship. This next question is for Dr. Palitha Kohona. This is the question. The panel of experts report of 2011 and OISL report 2015 from the base of 30/1 and 41 and other related UNHRC resolutions. Despite several attempts to challenge the accusations in the resolutions delivered, the two reports to UNHRC has never changed their stance. Is there a mechanism to discredit the two reports and remove them from UN database?
Well, there are different ways of approaching this. I personally take the view that these reports were not based on legal premises. They were based on political premises. Therefore, to get them removed, you need to approach them from a political perspective. We have endlessly submitted, as my good friend, Ambassador Mohan Peiris said, we have approached them from a very legalistic perspective up to now. We challenged the very various assertions. We have offered counter-arguments, but nothing seems to have changed. Nothing seems to have influenced the people who are drafting these, in my view, unsubstantiated and uninformed accusations. So what do? We need to try and approach this question in a political way. We need to convince the majority in the council that these are not really accusations that could be challenged or countered. They will be there forever because, as Goebel said, a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth. This is what is happening in Geneva. And then because of what's happening in Geneva, it is becoming the given in many journalistic circles, in academic circles, etc. We need to approach this differently. We need to approach this from a political perspective, strengthen our allies, build up our defenses, and deal with it in that way. It may be difficult, but other countries have been successful at the Human Rights Council, Cuba for one, while others seem to ignore whatever measures that they decide upon at the Human Rights Council. Because you have to remember, the Council or the High Commissioner have no power to enforce the decisions of the Council. So they now turn around and ask what they consider to be the international community, which is essentially a small group of Western countries, to use other measures against the countries that Human Rights Council doesn't like. Not all. I don't wish to name names, but it's only certain countries that are identified and take a hold over the courts. Sri Lanka is one of them. North Korea, Iran. Obviously, we are not very popular in certain circles. But to deal with them in a legalistic manner, I don't think is going to produce too many good results. They're not going to convince anybody because it is, as Lord Naseby and Mr. Mohan Peiris both have pointed out, the reports that they have produced over and over again are replete with inaccuracies and innuendos and suggestions. In those circumstances, I don't think it's going to serve much of a purpose to deal with them legalistically. The only way perhaps is to deal with them politically, but I have my doubts as to whether that approach is going to succeed as well. As I said earlier, there are some countries like Iran or North Korea, or Belarus, which have resolutions adopted against them almost every year, but they just ignore them. Israel is another country. Israel will have, again this year, up to 4 resolutions being adopted against it, maybe more. But does Israel react to those resolutions with any sensitivity? I doubt it. It's a difficult question, difficult situation for a small country like Sri Lanka to deal with. But in my view, we'll have to just live with it. And there's also a factor to be taken into account. The world does not consist only of a very small group of Western countries. The world consists of 193 members of the United Nations at this stage. The vast majority of them will not take Sri Lanka to task, except under pressure from the military aid providers and development aid providers. And that does cause certain countries to take an attitude which is not consistent with our interests. But then how do we deal with that? We don't provide aid to anybody. We don't provide a military umbrella to any country. So my answer is, I don't think that I answered the question adequately, but that's what the reality is, that we don't have that many choices. And then again, we have to make up our own minds as to whether we are going to take this institution seriously. Should we not go around and talk to our developing country friends and bring them onto our side? And then, as they did in 1999, I believe, initiate a program at the United Nations itself in New York. Mohan, this is for you, to have the Council reformed. The Council was never, in my view, and in the views of many writers, never intended to be a political body. It was going to be a technical body that was going to assist countries to improve their human rights performance. It was never intended to pick on countries and hold them over the coals, isolate them, embarrass them, and take them to task. That is not the mandate of the Council. The Council's mandate is to help countries, help the world to improve its human rights performance. And then we all must subscribe to that. The world can be made a better place, and we must all subscribe to that. But it's not, the Council's mandate is to help us to do that, not to point fingers, not to find guilty parties, not to recommend penalties.
Thank you, Dr. Kohona. That is one of the questions many people wanted to answer. I think many patriotic groups are wondering why Sri Lanka government is not responding to these allegations. So now it is quite clear from your point of view, there is no proper avenue legally challenge the Sri Lankan resolution. Am I right? Not resolutions, reports?
No, because the High Commissioner is independent. She can produce a report the way she likes, and she's an international civil servant.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's not a legal matter. It is procedural. the way that the Human Rights Council is functioning. So that is what we understand. Next question is to His Excellency Mohan Peiris. This is the question. The High Commissioner's report mentioned Sri Lanka's armed conflict emerged against the backdrop of deepening discrimination and marginalization of country's minorities, particularly Tamils. Do you agree with this simplistic view about the origin of war against LTTE?
Well, I think the response is pretty obvious. Well, I most respectfully disagree. But let me say this. The simplicity of what she is saying, in the simplicity of what she is saying, is a deeper message. I think we need to, in other words, there is an inbuilt sophistication in that simplicity. Palitha, you will agree with me on that. That these simple words look simple, but they're not there. There are much deeper. There is a latent kind of message that they bring to us. So, in as much as I disagree in which it is said, I would really, I would be careful not to dismiss it for the sake of its simplicity, but try and examine what the real message behind it is. And that is that we should try our level best to put our house in order. When I say that, I'm not saying our house is in disorder. I'm saying to do better. You know, I would look at it as an encouragement to do better. In other words, remember, our constitution has the directive principles of state policy. Our constitution also prescribes fundamental rights. Now, if you put fundamental rights together with the directive principles of state policy, it's not difficult perhaps to understand why people can critique us. So I would really say that I would look at the High Commissioner's report as an encouragement, right? To improve on what we are doing. In other words, further facilitate the lives of people so that our people can be happy. Right? As I said before, our ultimate goal is the happiness of our people. And that's what we need to achieve. How we achieve it is of not too much of a consequence. So really the High Commissioner's report, there is exaggeration, there are inaccuracies, there are falsehoods. It reeks with a cocktail of unfounded critique. But having said that, you cannot actually dismiss it for that simply because it's loaded with that kind of rhetoric. But I would rather do some soul searching and examine our own mechanisms so that our own environment would be better for our people, so that everyone, irrespective of who you are, whether to whichever ethnic group you belong to, whichever religious group you belong to, that we will side by side, we will live happily. Remember, these problems that we have had in the country, there are lots of lessons that we need to learn. One lesson I think that we have learned is that we need each other, right? As a group, whether we belong to the Tamil community or the Sinhalese community or the Muslim community, that we need each other. If the pandemic has brought through one message quite clearly, is the pandemic was no respecter of ethnicity, of racial divisions, religious divisions, nothing, not even sovereignty. It spared none of us. So there you are. That's how we were treated. We were made to realize that we are simply pitiless, humble human beings crying for survival. Remember, the supreme irony of creation is that nothing is permanent, and that we are living on a planet hovering around one of the lesser stars. That's how small we are. So during this short sojourn on this earthly paradise, if I was to describe it that way, surely we don't have too much of time, but to do good. And good, I mean do good and live happily with our brothers and sisters around us. That is the message. So that, I think, is the ultimate message we should go away with. I don't think we should feel discouraged with this report. I think we should probably take it as a source of encouragement. Throw the rhetoric out. Throw the, in other words, reject we won't lose the woods for the trees, right? Throw the critique out. But fundamentally, remember, even if this was not there, every 4 years we come up in the Universal Periodic Review. And that review comes up in September of this year. Every country is subject to a universal, the UPR, the mechanism. And that is the traditional mechanism by which countries are reviewed every 4 years. Then the whole world is entitled to critique us, right? Remember, that mechanism is there. We would have in any event been critiqued at the Universal Periodic Review, except that this core group finds us a seasonal punching bag when it comes up in Geneva from time to time at their convenience. So there you are. Let's prepare for the UPR and get our mechanisms right. I think we've got an opportunity to get these mechanisms right and ensure that those mechanisms will result in benefit to the communities that live in this country of ours. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question, this is for Lord Naseby. This is from Shanta Disanayaka. This is about the news reports we are reading sometimes, that most of the missing persons registered in Sri Lanka appeared in different countries. There was a recent court case in Germany as well. So this question is, do you think requesting UNHRC to share their data on refugees registered with them will be a mean to find an accurate figure about the number of people who died during the war?
It's a very good question. I mean, I actually think in the core group, we have 3 key countries in relation to people who have left Sri Lanka. There's obviously the UK, Canada, and Germany. Now, each of those countries have had people applying for asylum, and most of them have probably got through and are now residing in those countries. Now, has anybody in those countries, and I talk about my own country, why doesn't the Home Office release in confidence to the Commission the names of all the people that have been taken in on amnesty, with a guarantee from the government of Sri Lanka, or particularly the Commission, that, if you like, even anonymize them, so they can check those names against the names that they have got, and a tremendous number were collected under the Panagama report, and also the ICRC did a lot of work. They could be double checked against it. That would help enormously. So if you've got Canada, Germany, and the UK doing that, now the catalyst for that does have to be the UNHRC. It's no good to Sri Lankans necessarily asking for it, but there's nothing to stop the UNHRC acting as that catalyst.
Thank you, Your Lordship. Next question is for both Dr. Kohona and Your Excellency Mohan Peiris. This is a very small question, but I will present it in that way. Does the current government has an action plan to counter the actions of a global LTTE? This is from Ranil Jayanati from Switzerland.
Palitha, would you like?
You want to go first?
Okay. Let me tell you this. Wherever the government has had to neutralize LTT propaganda and the propaganda of the diaspora, certainly the government has taken very effective measures through its embassies and its missions abroad to neutralize such misinformation. there is a well-established mechanism by which such disinformation is being confronted with direct facts. Now, having said that, remember for the LTTE, that is the LTT and some parts of the diaspora, that's the only job they have. That's all they have to do. In the sense they spend most of their time quite effectively sitting down with their pens or their computers, spreading disinformation. Now, a government has much more than that to do. But having said that, let me assure you that there is a mechanism within the different departments of government to keep a track of those of them who are spreading disinformation, and to keep, mind you, this very group that is spreading disinformation, who is spreading false propaganda, enjoy the hospitality of Sri Lanka, and they visit Sri Lanka quite often. We know that, and I think the government is keeping a close track of that, right? So you can't have the benefits of both sides of the world. You can't have the cake and eat it. You run Sri Lanka down on the one side when you're here in this part of the world, and you get back there, you enjoy their hospitality, unconditionally. So let me again appeal to my Tamil brothers and sisters who are living outside Sri Lanka to desist from these old antagonisms. We have to put all this baggage behind us. I tell my Sinhalese friends also that we need to put the baggage behind us and look to the future. After all, we were all born back in that country. We're all part of that country. Once upon a time, our families lived together, interacted together. There was a lot of fellowship and love in these amongst communities. I think there's an urgent need to work towards that goal, not to drift away from each other as we are seeking to do. So, my dear friends, there we are. In as much as I think the suspicion of each other we must work towards an end, an eradication of that suspicion of each other. There is no need for that, and there is no place for that in this modern world. What is the result of that? That the international community exploits that very situation to their advantage. That's what they're doing. Look at the diaspora living in these parts of the world. Are they really happy? Touch your hearts and ask yourself the question. I visit my friends. I have friends, relations. I have close family married into the different communities. Touch your hearts and ask yourself the question whether you are completely happy in this part of the world. I'm not saying, well, we can be happy. Of course we can. But is the material happiness what you're chasing behind? Isn't it the mirage of just materialism, cars, houses, good living? Is that what you want? But finally, I find that there's a clamor to go back, a clamor to have a sense of belonging to where you came from. Isn't that what we like? So really, we all have, I would say, a trust that has been bestowed on us to work towards a stronger, better, a more understanding Sri Lankan community. And that is a trust. In that trust equally applies to the majority community and the minority communities, that we live together as brothers and sisters of one family. So let's leave the mechanisms of trying to find out about each other. I think we know too much of each other's activities. Put that in the past, put the baggage behind, consign it to take it off our minds, and inculcate within us a sense of love by which we can approach each other and join hands in ensuring that Sri Lanka rises to those new horizons of freedom and of progress. Thank you.
Let me add a couple of thoughts to that, Jayaraj.
Yes, sir.
The Sri Lankan government, by and large, is aware of what's going on in the expatriate Tamil community. But as Ambassador Peiris mentioned, the government has many other responsibilities, not only the expatriate Tamil community, to deal with. So when you think of it, the resources of the government get spread out rather thin on the ground. Then, of course, there is also a question of financial resources. They're not always readily available, even though missions may want to undertake certain initiatives. These things cannot be done easily due to the lack of financial resources. And then, of course, on the other hand, the expatriate activists have a ready source of financing. We really don't know where the financing comes from, but the financing is there. They have enough funds to go and lobby local politicians, enough funds to contribute to their election campaigns, and a willingness to deliver or promise to deliver block votes. You've seen David Miliband's own comment later appearing in WikiLeaks, where he said that he has a Tamil constituency to look after. So his activism may not have been purely altruistic, may have been conditioned, maybe have been motivated by the fact there were Tamil votes in his constituency. So these are factors that we need to keep in mind. And then also, it's not every expatriate like you, Jayaraj, who will spend time and energy organizing seminars like this. There'll be many who would have gone to sleep by now because they couldn't be bothered listening to what's going on. So we have this imbalance in the way this issue is approached. The government is constrained by a lack of resources. Sometimes they may not even have the correct motivation. Like, for example, during the previous 5 years, from 2015 to 2019, certainly the government did not address this issue in a constructive and considered manner, in my view. And then on the other hand, you have the expatriate groups who are well-funded, motivated, and they are well-organized. Something I have noticed both in the United States, in England, and in Australia is that these groups can be marshaled at very short notice. You see them demonstrating in shopping centers or even outside parliament houses. This is a phenomenon that an elected, a legitimate government will find difficult to counter in any country. I mean, if you want to raise hundreds of people to marshal hundreds of people to demonstrate against the UK government on many issues, it can be done. You saw the number of people who gathered during the BLM demonstrations. It can be done. And a democratically elected government will find it very difficult to deal with that situation or counter it. In many situations, it's best to ignore it or accommodate it. Expression, I mean, to demonstrate is a right in a free society. So if the LTTE and its rump groups wish to demonstrate, wish to raise their voices, carry flags, I don't think there is much use in getting hot under the collar. There's no need to get hot and bothered. They'll do it. And it will come a time, I think, over the years, they themselves will tire of it. At the moment, and I noticed that the demonstrations are much less enthusiastic now than they were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they could bring the city of Toronto to a halt, Sydney to a halt, London to a halt. Thousands would gather, but it's no longer the case. You can't marshal anything more than a few hundred, even on the most difficult, the most convenient of times. So I think we just need to keep on talking to these expatriate groups, as Mohan said, reach out to them, and also encourage them to go back and see how things have changed in Sri Lanka. Go to Palihawadana, 90% Tamil. When I was growing up, Palihawadana was not 90% Tamil. Devala, Pambalapitiya. And that's a good thing, that the Tamil people of this country voluntarily move into the majority areas because they find it comfortable. Go and look at the temples in Colombo, Hindu temples. Go and look at the schools that they have. And then if you go to any business establishment, any government office, you find that there are a significant number of Tamils working in those areas. The business community is well represented. The Tamil community is well represented in the business community. Similarly, in the legal profession, just go to Housedog. And so I think if these angry people, angry Tamil expatriates, come back to Colombo and mix around, they'll see that Sri Lanka of today is not the Sri Lanka of 20, 30 years ago. People do not go around fearing each other. They get on with each other. That is what we have to do. And this is the message we have to take out. I don't think, going to court or being proactively anti-expatriate groups is going to solve this problem. In fact, then it might even encourage them to do what they're doing further. Reach out, let them see what's going on in Sri Lanka. And then again, in my own view, the best thing we can do to address this issue is ensure that every individual is treated equally. Every individual gets the same opportunities, irrespective of race, ethnicity, language, or religion. And every individual must be treated with the same dignity. I think that will get us somewhere. If not today, maybe tomorrow or the day after.
Thank you. That is a very good approach and very informative. And next question, I think we will stick to only 2 more questions before we conclude this session. I know Ambassador Kohona, it is midnight in China by now. It is very, thank you very much for spending that much of time and in this time of the night. And this question is for Lord Naseby. It is actually from me. Your Lordship, we are aware that you have some representation from yourself to the United Nations High Commissioner recently. And first question is, I just wanted to know whether you like to share with us in that some updates on that one. And the second question is, we have seen some information that last week you raised a question in the House of Lords, and you got a reply from the relevant minister. So would you like to give us some update on this one? These 2 questions.
Well, in answer to the first question, I have sent to Geneva to Madame Bachelet, who is the commissioner, a copy of the report I referred to this afternoon, and a short covering note. I have actually met her before when she was president of Chile, and I run in London a thing called the Cofradía del Vino Chileno. That is a Chilean wine association, so it's a wine tasting of Chilean wine. But of course, wine is important to Chile. So I just hope that personal dimension might persuade her to look carefully at the report that I made. Secondly, you asked about the written question. Well, I was totally amazed. I thought to myself, well, there are the Colonel Gash's dispatches that I obtained, full of redactions, but they're in the public domain. And has the government sent them to the UNHRC? So I asked this innocent question and added, are they sent either in the redacted form or the unredacted? Because ideally it ought to be in the unredacted. And the answer comes back, and I'll read it. The UK government has not received any request from the UN Human Rights Council for copies of dispatches written by the former Defence Attaché at the British High Commission in Sri Lanka, Lieutenant Colonel Gash, about events in Sri Lanka related to the Civil War, and has not provided any. So here we are, the focal point of the whole of this terrible report, in my judgment, the focal point, and they haven't even got them, unless somebody else has delivered them to them. So I've just put down 4 more questions, one of which will be, or I will be putting 4 more down, one of which will be, has anybody actually briefed our 2 senior diplomats in Geneva on Colonel Gash's dispatches? Because the implication is they probably haven't got them either. So no wonder we're getting reports that are inaccurate. And frankly, as both my colleagues have said this afternoon, have remained unchanged since the original report was done, the Dar es Salaam report, by the 3 senior UN people.
Thank you, Your Lordship. We go to the last question. This is from Amal Abhiwadana, good friend of Lord Naseby. But this is not actually for Your Lordship, but Your Lordship may give some comments afterward. This is for both Dr. Kohona and the Ambassador Mohan Peiris. This is the question. There is growing interest amongst civil society in Sri Lanka to establish a genuine Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, to address the legacy of the past. The Sirisena and Wickremesinghe government prepared a draft TRC, but it was never finalized. How can the current Sri Lankan government be urged to proceed with establishing with their own TRC mechanism that would be unique to Sri Lanka?
Palitha, can I answer that?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah. Now, that's a good question. Let me straight away say this. I think civil society has a very serious and important role to play in the reconciliation process, and that must be played constructively. That's number 1. Number 2, you probably know that the Commission of Inquiry has been established. As I speak, it's been gazetted for a Supreme Court judge to chair a 4-member committee, a commission of inquiry consisting of a member from the Tamil community, the Muslim community, also in that committee of 4. So there is a commission of inquiry as pledged by the Honorable Minister in Geneva when he went there last, has now been established and is now sitting. And there was I think the advertisement, the notices in the newspapers have gone out calling for representations and for evidence or material viva voce. So the commission is headed by no less a person than His Lordship Justice Nawaz of the Supreme Court. And the commission consists of 4 commissioners. And they have been mandated, amongst other things, to do a gap analysis of the various commissions that have actually sat before and put out their reports, such as the Lessons and Reconciliation Commission, Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, the Office of the Missing Persons, the Office of Reparations, the Office of National Reconciliation, and so on and so forth. So the mechanism is in place. And I think that's important. And I think members of the civil society should go before that commission and assist the commission with whatever material they think would be useful in coming up with a final formula, to ensure that it will produce a report that as a final formula to bring about peace and reconciliation amongst our community. So that's a very fine opportunity that has now been made available by the government. Thank you.
Just to add to that, Jayaraj, I don't think personally that we should emphasize that there is a lack of reconciliation in this country. I think the communities live reasonably well with each other. You go anywhere in the country, there are Sinhalese living amongst the Tamils, Tamils living amongst the Sinhalese, Muslims living everywhere. So when you use this word reconciliation, we should avoid creating the impression that the communities are at each other's throats, which is not the case. Today, there are marriages occurring across community and religious lines. Children go to school with each other, and the temples are scattered. Temples, mosques, and churches are scattered everywhere. So I think it's very important not to overemphasize this reconciliation part. We need to get on with each other, but as to whether we should call it reconciliation, which suggests that we are not getting on with each other. We are, as a country, we are getting on with each other much better than most other countries. And it's very important to remember that. Secondly, if we want to stir up the past, scratch our old wounds, I think we must discourage that also. Scratching our old wounds might give us temporary pleasure, but it will only keep the pain alive. And I think, again, that is something we should avoid as a people. We need to be looking to the future, addressing whatever has to be addressed now and getting over with it. We should not be scratching the wound, that old wound, as the LTT, Rump LTT wants everyone to do. That is what they are doing. I don't think we should fall into the same trap. We should get on with life. I think there's a high degree of harmony in this country. And that is what we need to emphasize, not the lack of harmony. We should stop scratching that old wound and get on with life and ensure that there is harmony rather than disharmony. Personally, I think we must get over this thing of reconciliation. Reconciliation, the word by itself, suggests that there is no peace amongst the communities, that there is pain and hatred, which I don't think is the case. You just got to go and move around with the people. And I don't think that's the case in Sri Lanka. There may be some who feel hurt. And of course, people feel hurt. Like Lord Naseby said, the relatives of the 600 policemen or the relatives of the 6 or 7 children who were murdered in Trincomalee, they will continue to feel the hurt. But that is not what we need to be emphasizing. What we need to be emphasizing is the fact that our communities can get on. And so that I would like to leave as the final message.
I would fully concur. I would completely concur with what Palitha finally said, and that sums up, that would sum up what the mood should be. Thank you.
Your Lordship would like to add something to it?
Very difficult. I think Palitha gets it right. My concern as a practicing politician and as someone who was an advertising man for many years is perception. And we have, what, 300,000 Tamils in the UK or thereabouts, 1 million plus in Canada, and the 2 ambassadors know what the numbers are elsewhere. I suspect, and I really do applaud what's been done, that we've just heard about the Supreme Court judge and the other members. I think somehow the diaspora, who are very active, may need a mechanism to be able to make an input into this body that's just been set up. I don't know the methodology, but I just have, as somebody who's had a constituency for 25 years, still active, I think we need some mechanism for those who are living overseas to make a contribution.
Thank you, Your Lordship. There is one final question that is going to be, I have to ask this question. This is from, because Your Lordship has mentioned this one before. This is about the Adele Balasingham is living in UK. This is from Kapila Jayasena. He is asking how we could bring charges against Mrs. Balasingham, who lives Greater London, who gave cyanide capsules to young children of Sri Lanka.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I mean, I don't know how the mechanism is, but she or he has a member of parliament. You might start there.
If I can add to that, I think Mrs. Balasingham must be a prisoner of her own conscience. And that kind of sentence would be far more lethal and effective than any custodial sentence.
Agreed.
I think, thank you very much. That is, I think we should conclude our session because we are very more past our time. I would like to make a thanking note for everyone involved with this one. We would like to thank many supported individuals to give us a support to get this event success. We got Anura and his one of his friend prepared this opening video, especially Ruwan Parakramaja, Dr. Ruwan Parakramaja supported with the questions and the background support, and Dr. Neville Havage, our partner organization, heading our partner organization, Ontario Policy Research, and Ranjiv Gunawardana as a facilitator and coordinated with some of the speakers. And also thankful to our other individuals and the organizations supported to get this event success. Our special thanks to speakers, especially Lord Naseby, Ambassador Dr. Kohona, and UN representative Dr. Mohan Peiris. Finally, we thank you all for joining us once again. I do apologize not being able to answer all your questions, and I have to apologize again for not being able to all of the registered people to join in, because we wasn't expected that much of participation. Normally it's a half of the crowd registered participating, so this one is go beyond that. And thank you very much for everyone for your patience. We started a little bit late. Anyway, it is, we hope that the Sri Lanka will, as your lordship always mentioned, and during one of these speeches, your lordship mentioned this very well, that let the Sri Lankan people to stand up again. They suffered enough. So that is the thought we have. That is the request from the international community. We are appealing. Thank you very much for everyone. Now this session is concluded. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Palitha.
Goodbye. Goodbye, Lord Naseby.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Sleep
everyone.
well,
Thank you.
Kohona.